The Green River flows out of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state, winding westward through valleys and forests before joining the Duwamish River south of Seattle. It's a beautiful river in places, shaded by Douglas fir and western red cedar, its banks thick with salmonberry and fern. Steelhead and Chinook salmon move through its waters. In summer, the air smells of pine and cold, fresh water. In August of 1982, the Green River became something else. It became a burial ground. It became the signature of a killer who would operate in the Pacific Northwest for nearly 20 years, who would claim more lives than any other confirmed serial killer in American history, and who would evade one of the largest and longest criminal investigations ever conducted in the United States. He was not a dramatic figure. He did not wear masks or write letters to newspapers or leave elaborate clues. He was, by every outward measure, an unremarkable man, a truck painter who drove an ordinary pickup truck, who attended church, who coached Little League, who had neighbors who thought he was quiet and decent. He was the man nobody suspected precisely because he looked like every man, because he blended into the landscape of American suburban life so completely that even people who knew him had no reason to look twice. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, and between 1982 and 2000, he murdered at least 49 women, though investigators believe the true number may be significantly higher. He dumped their bodies in the forests and river valleys of King County, Washington, sometimes returning to visit them, sometimes leaving them for years until hikers or hunters stumbled across bleached bones in the undergrowth. For 20 years he drove to work, he painted trucks, he went to church, he got married 3 times, he mowed his lawn, he killed. This is the story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. This is the story of 49 women whose lives were taken by a man they thought might offer help or money or simply a ride. This is the story of the investigators who spent decades trying to find him, and the DNA technology that finally did what human investigation could not. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Predator. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of 3 sons born to Thomas Newton Ridgway and Mary Rita Steinman. The Ridgway family moved to the Seattle area when Gary was young, settling eventually in the working-class neighborhood of McMicken Heights near the city of SeaTac, Washington, the strip of unincorporated land that lies between Seattle and Tacoma, dominated in those years by motels, fast food restaurants, strip malls, and the noise of aircraft from SeaTac International Airport. It was a world without glamour or pretension, a world of people who worked in factories, drove trucks, painted things, built things, and came home tired at night to modest houses on flat streets. Gary would spend essentially his entire life in this world. He would never leave it geographically, never try to escape it economically, never seek any life other than the one handed to him at birth. His parents' marriage was volatile and unhappy. His father, Tom, was a bus driver and later a postal worker, a passive man who drank and avoided conflict and largely stayed out of Gary's upbringing. His mother, Mary, was the dominant force in the household, and the domestic dynamic was charged and dysfunctional in ways that would leave deep marks on Gary's developing psychology. Mary Ridgway was controlling, domineering, and apparently sexually confusing to her sons. Investigators and psychologists who later examined Gary's history would note that Mary had an unusual relationship with her body and with cleanliness that she communicated to her children in disturbing ways. She was known to compulsively wash herself, sometimes bathing multiple times a day, and she involved Gary in ways that were inappropriate and damaging. Gary would later tell investigators that his mother would wash his genitals well into an age when this was no longer developmentally appropriate, behavior that created a profound sexual confusion in a child who was already struggling. The household was frequently loud and combative. Tom and Mary fought constantly, their arguments sometimes physical. Gary witnessed his parents' violence regularly, growing up in an atmosphere of tension and unpredictability, where affection and aggression became tangled together in ways that he couldn't process. He learned early that the relationship between men and women was adversarial and confusing, a source of pain and power in equal measure. Gary was not an academically gifted child. He struggled in school from the very beginning, reading slowly, having difficulty retaining information, falling behind his classmates in subjects that seemed to come easily to others. He was eventually diagnosed with a low IQ, scoring in the 80s on standard intelligence tests, technically within the normal range but at the low end, enough to make academic work genuinely difficult. He repeated a grade and was sometimes placed in special classes for slower learners, experiences that humiliated him and reinforced his sense of being lesser, of being someone the world didn't think much of. Despite his academic difficulties, Gary was not visibly antisocial or aggressive as a child. He didn't torture animals or bully smaller children, or display the early warning signs that criminologists sometimes identify in later killers. He was described as quiet and unremarkable, someone who faded into the background, who didn't draw attention in any direction, not good enough to be praised, not bad enough to be noticed. But there were signs, visible in retrospect, that something was wrong with Gary's inner world. He began setting fires as a young child, small fires in fields and empty lots, a behavior strongly associated with developing antisocial pathology. He wet the bed until an embarrassingly late age, another marker that psychologists have linked to childhood anxiety and the conditions that sometimes precede violent behavior in adulthood. And he had disturbing sexual thoughts from an early age. Gary would later tell investigators that he began fantasizing about killing women when he was approximately 13 or 14 years old, around the time he was going through puberty. These weren't vague or abstract thoughts. They were specific, recurrent fantasies about control and domination and the killing of women. He kept these fantasies private, told no one, and began building an inner life structured around them. This is one of the most chilling aspects of Gary Ridgway's case, the gap between who he appeared to be and who he actually was. The shy, slow, unremarkable boy in McMicken Heights was simultaneously constructing an elaborate fantasy life centered on murder. The disconnect between his outer passivity and his inner violence was not a sudden break that happened later in life. It was there from the beginning, baked into his adolescence. At approximately 13, Gary committed an act that might, in another household or another time, have triggered intervention. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods near their neighborhood and stabbed him with a penknife, injuring but not killing the child. Gary later described feeling a rush of excitement from the act, a sense of power and aliveness that he'd never experienced before. But the incident was either not reported or not taken seriously enough to result in any consequences for Gary. The boy recovered. The stabbing faded from official awareness, and Gary learned that he could act out his violent impulses without facing any consequences. He graduated from Tyee High School in 1969, a modest achievement that had taken him longer than his peers, and went to work rather than continuing his education. He took jobs in a variety of places before settling into work as a truck painter, a skilled trade that required attention to detail and physical stamina, but not the academic abilities he lacked. He would work in this field at the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, Washington, for the rest of his working life, first as a painter and eventually as a master painter. He was, colleagues said, very good at his job. In 1970, Gary married for the first time, a woman named Claudia Barrows. The marriage lasted barely 2 years, with Claudia describing Gary as controlling, interested in kinky sex involving tying her up, and prone to taking her to areas of SeaTac known for prostitution, where he would solicit women for sex while Claudia waited in the car. This was apparently not the relationship Claudia had imagined when she married, and she left him. After his divorce, Gary began frequenting the prostitution strip along Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road through SeaTac lined with motels and fast food joints where women worked the sidewalks and parking lots. He became a regular customer, developing a pattern of hearing prostitutes that would continue for the rest of his life, even during his marriages, even while attending church, even while maintaining the facade of a decent, ordinary man. In 1973, Gary married again, this time to a woman named Marcia Winslow. This marriage lasted slightly longer, about a decade, but was characterized by the same pattern. Gary continued soliciting prostitutes throughout the marriage, continued taking Marcia to the strip sometimes, continued feeding the compulsions that no one around him fully understood. He had a son with Marcia, a boy named Matthew, born in 1975. Gary was reportedly a decent enough father to Matthew during the child's early years, present and attentive in the limited way that seemed to be his emotional capacity. But the marriage deteriorated, and Marcia and Gary divorced in the early 1980s. Gary was not an isolated loner in the way that many serial killers are portrayed. He had coworkers who liked him, acquaintances from church, a social world of a limited but recognizable kind. He attended church regularly. He was a born-again Christian, or claimed to be, a man who carried a Bible to work and sometimes quoted scripture, and this church-going gave him both a veneer of respectability and a rich irony that would become apparent only much later. He joined a church-organized Bible study group. He brought colleagues to church. He spoke earnestly about faith, and during this same period, he was picking up women on Pacific Highway South and killing them. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain both of these lives, the church-going, Bible-quoting family man and the systematic hunter of women, was extraordinary. But Gary seemed to manage it without apparent difficulty. His inner compartmentalization was as complete as his outward blandness. He was two entirely different people sharing a single body and a single suburban house, and neither one seemed aware that the other was a problem. By the time 1982 arrived, Gary Ridgway was 33 years old, recently divorced from his second wife, living alone, working his truck painting job, attending church, and preparing to begin one of the longest and most devastating series of murders in American history. Part 2, The Killing Begins, 1982. The summer of 1982 was warm and dry in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of summer that draws people outdoors, to rivers and lakes, and the forests that surround the Seattle metropolitan area. The tourist season was in full swing, and Pacific Highway South was busy with travelers stopping at the motels that lined both sides of the road. It was along this highway, and in the river valleys nearby, that Gary Ridgway began his killing. His first confirmed victim was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old girl who had been placed in foster care and who had drifted into street-level prostitution in the SeaTac area. Wendy was young, heartbreakingly young, a teenager trying to survive in circumstances that no teenager should face. She was last seen in early July 1982. On July 15, 1982, her body was recovered from the Green River near the Peck Bridge in Auburn, Washington. She had been manually strangled. She was found face down in the water. Wendy Caulfield's body might have been treated as a tragedy of street life, the kind of case that was heartbreaking but not unusual in the world of runaway teenagers and street prostitution. But in the weeks that followed, more bodies appeared. On August 12, 1982, two young men riding inner tubes on the Green River near the town of Tukwila made a discovery that would shock the region and launch one of the greatest manhunts in Pacific Northwest history. They found the bodies of two women in the river, Marcia Faye Chapman, 31 years old, and Cynthia Jean Hines, 17 years old. Both had been manually strangled. Both had been placed in the river in a specific way that suggested deliberate staging. The following day, on August 13, another body was recovered from the river. Opal Charmin Mills, 16 years old, also strangled, also placed in the river with apparent deliberateness. 4 bodies in a month from the same river. 3 of them recovered within 2 days of each other. The King County Police recognized immediately that they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who was hunting women in the SeaTac corridor, strangling them, and dumping them in the Green River. The King County Police formed the Green River Task Force in August 1982, an investigative unit dedicated entirely to identifying and capturing the killer. The task force would grow over the years, shrink, be restructured, be supplemented with outside expertise, consume millions of dollars, and involve hundreds of investigators. It would become one of the longest-running serial killer investigations in American history. In those early weeks, the task force had no shortage of leads. The Seattle area had a robust sex worker community along Pacific Highway South, and many of these women had dangerous encounters with clients regularly. Police interviewed dozens of women, collected descriptions of violent or threatening Johns, built databases of potential suspects. They had descriptions of vehicles, partial license plate numbers, physical descriptions of men who had behaved aggressively. Gary Ridgway came to the attention of investigators relatively early. In 1982, he had been questioned by police after one of the women he'd hired had complained about him. She described a violent encounter in which he'd attempted to choke her, and while the encounter had been technically consensual in terms of the commercial transaction, the choking had been more than she bargained for. Gary was interviewed by detectives and gave smooth, cooperative answers. He denied having anything to do with the murders. Police had no hard evidence against him at that point, and the interview went nowhere. But his name was in the files. It would stay there for the next 20 years. The killings continued throughout 1982 and into 1983 with terrible regularity. Gary was hunting with increasing efficiency and confidence, building a methodology that made him extremely difficult to catch. His approach was deceptively simple. He would drive the strip along Pacific Highway South, making eye contact with women working the sidewalks, stopping to negotiate a commercial transaction. He would pay for sex, drive to a secluded location, and during or after the sexual act, he would manually strangle his victim. He would then transport the body to a dump site, usually in a wooded area not far from where he lived and worked, and dispose of it. His dump sites were carefully chosen. He preferred areas of dense vegetation where bodies would be hidden from casual view. He used multiple sites, returning to some repeatedly, never establishing a pattern obvious enough to lead police directly to him. He sometimes visited his dump sites after leaving victims there, behavior that gave him a sense of ownership and power over the dead. He also, horrifyingly, sometimes returned to have sex with corpses he'd left in the woods, behavior known as necrophilia that revealed the depth of his pathological need for control. For Gary, the appeal of his victims was not merely the killing but the ongoing possession. A dead woman couldn't leave, couldn't reject him, couldn't call the police. She was entirely his. The geographical scope of the murders was remarkable. Gary's dump sites spread across a wide area of King County, from the river valleys near Auburn to the forests along the Snoqualmie Valley, from areas near the airport to rural roads in the hills east of Seattle. He used this geographic spread deliberately, believing, correctly, for many years, that it would make it harder for police to connect the cases and identify a central operating area. Gary also took steps to complicate victim identification. He sometimes left rocks or other items with the bodies in ways that seemed deliberate. He occasionally moved bodies after initially depositing them. He was aware, on some level, that police were looking for patterns, and he worked to disrupt pattern recognition. But the most effective protection Gary had was simply who he was. He was a truck painter from SeaTac. He went to church. He had a job and a son and a house. The profile of a serial killer that existed in the public and law enforcement imagination in 1982 was of someone dramatic, memorable, unusual, someone like Ted Bundy, who had been captured just 3 years earlier in Florida. Gary was the opposite of memorable. He was the man you'd forget the moment he left the room. Part 3. The Investigation and its failures. The Green River Task Force threw enormous resources at the case throughout the 1980s. At its peak, the task force employed 45 investigators working full-time, supported by administrative staff, analysts, and consultants. They had one of the largest investigative databases in the history of Pacific Northwest law enforcement, tens of thousands of tips, hundreds of suspects, thousands of witness statements. And they couldn't find him. The reasons for this failure are complex and instructive, and they tell us as much about the limitations of pre-DNA law enforcement as they do about Gary Ridgway's particular cunning. The task force's primary investigative approach was behavioral, trying to build a profile of the killer based on the evidence and victim patterns, and then using that profile to identify suspects. They consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit, which had pioneered criminal profiling through the work of agents like Robert Ressler and John Douglas. The profile they developed was reasonably accurate in some ways. The killer was likely a white male in his 30s, had some familiarity with the victim pool and the geography, was organized and methodical, probably appeared normal to those who knew him. But a profile is not an identification. It describes a category of person, not a specific individual. And in a metropolitan area like Greater Seattle, there were thousands of men who fit the general profile. The task force also struggled with the nature of the victim population. The majority of Gary's victims were women working as prostitutes, young women, many of them teenagers, many from marginalized backgrounds, many with substance abuse issues, many without stable family connections. Some had run away from home. Some were in the foster care system. Some had burned their bridges with family long before they disappeared. This victim selection was not accidental on Gary's part. He later explained his thinking with chilling clarity. He chose sex workers because he believed, and was not entirely wrong, that their disappearances would receive less investigative attention than the disappearances of women with stable families, regular social networks, and jobs. He believed that society would care less about finding their killers. He believed they were less likely to be missed. This calculation was rooted in the ugliest kind of social reality. The women Gary targeted were, in many cases, society's most vulnerable members, people who had fallen through every net, who had no one reliably advocating for them, whose reports of violence were sometimes dismissed by police who had limited patience for street-level prostitution complaints. When they disappeared, the investigations were sometimes slower to start, the resources sometimes harder to mobilize, the public sympathy sometimes harder to generate. The Green River Task Force, to its credit, took the cases seriously, far more seriously than Gary had anticipated. But even dedicated investigators working with the tools available in the 1980s faced genuine structural challenges in solving a case like this one. The victim pool was large and transient. Witnesses from the Strip were often unwilling to speak to police. The crime scenes yielded limited forensic evidence at a time before DNA technology made biological traces into definitive identifications. Gary was also helped by a particular stroke of timing. In 1984, just as the task force was building momentum and beginning to develop leads, a celebrity consultation changed the investigation's focus in ways that would consume enormous resources and ultimately prove counterproductive. The FBI consulted with Ted Bundy, then on death row in Florida, asking for his insights into the Green River killer's psychology. Bundy, who was brilliant and manipulative and always looking for leverage that might extend his life, provided analysis that was compelling and largely accurate about the killer's psychology. But Bundy also suggested that the killer was likely returning to the dump sites to continue engaging with the bodies, and recommended specific surveillance strategies based on this hypothesis. The task force dedicated significant resources to watching known and suspected dump sites in hopes of catching the killer returning to them. Gary did return to some sites, but not consistently enough, and not to the sites that were being watched. The surveillance operation consumed years of investigative hours and produced nothing of value. Ted Bundy was executed in January 1989. The Green River Task Force continued its work, but the investigation had lost momentum. By the late 1980s, with the killings apparently having slowed, though Gary never completely stopped, public attention had shifted and funding became harder to justify. The task force was reduced in size multiple times, eventually shrinking to a small core team that kept the case files alive while pursuing other duties. Throughout all of this, Gary Ridgway continued his life in SeaTac. In 1988, Gary married for the third time. His new wife was Judith Lynch, a woman he'd met through personal ads, and their relationship would prove far more stable than his previous marriages. Judith was a cheerful, outdoorsy woman who had no idea who she had married. She thought Gary was a decent man, a churchgoer, a hard worker. She would later describe the revelation of his true nature as the most devastating thing she'd ever experienced. Gary and Judith bought a house together in Auburn. He continued working at Kenworth. He continued his church activities. He continued, though perhaps at a reduced rate from the frenetic killing of the early 1980s, to pick up women on the strip and murder them. Among those who investigated the case during this middle period, there was one detective who never gave up, Dave Reichert, who had been among the first responders when the bodies were found in the Green River in August 1982, and who would dedicate much of his career to finding the killer. Reichert's dedication was both professional and personal. He had looked at those bodies in the river and made a commitment that was more than just a job. He would later write about the case in a book called Chasing the Devil, and he would eventually become the King County Sheriff. Through all of it, the Green River case remained the defining work of his professional life. Reichert and the remaining task force members kept Gary Ridgway in their files. They interviewed him again in the 1980s, and again Gary was cooperative, calm, and apparently forthcoming. In 1987, as part of the investigation, Gary even agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed it. This is one of the most remarkable and disturbing facts about Gary Ridgway. He was able to pass a polygraph test while being the person they were looking for. His ability to compartmentalize, to detach his emotional responses from his answers, apparently allowed him to respond to questions about the murders without the physiological arousal that polygraph machines detect. Whether this was a deliberate skill or simply a natural product of his particular psychology is unclear. What is clear is that it worked. Gary was known as a suspect. He had been interviewed, he had taken a polygraph, and he had walked away free every time. Part 4, the VICTIMS, Part 1. Before continuing with the investigation, it is essential to pause and remember the women whose lives Gary Ridgway took. These were not abstractions, not numbers in a body count, not merely evidence in a criminal case. They were human beings with histories and hopes and people who loved them. They deserved long lives. They deserved better than what they got. Gary's confirmed victims numbered 49, though investigators believe the real total may be significantly higher. Gary himself claimed to have killed more than 70 women, though he couldn't always provide verifiable details for each. The 49 confirmed victims span from 1982 to 1998, with a cluster of intense activity in 1982 and 1983, and continuing murders through the following decade. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old. She had been in the foster care system, had been placed in multiple homes, and had ended up on the streets of SeaTac before she was old enough to drive. She wanted to be a nurse. She had a gap-toothed smile in photographs that makes her look startlingly young, which she was. She was Gary's first known victim, found in the Green River in July 1982. Marcia Faye Chapman was 31 years old, older than most of Gary's victims. She had a son and a daughter and had fallen into addiction and street work after a difficult adulthood. She was a mother who loved her children. She was found in the Green River in August 1982. Cynthia Jean Hines was 17. She was young and pretty and had been working the strip for only a short time before Gary found her. She was found in the Green River the same day as Marcia Chapman. Opal Charmin Mills was 16. She was a young woman from a relatively stable family who had made choices that placed her in Gary's path. Her family searched for her, hoped she would come home, and eventually received the news that no family wants to receive. She was found the day after Marcia and Cynthia in the same stretch of river. Deborah Lynn Bonner was 23. She had a daughter. She had been trying to get off the streets but kept getting pulled back. She was found in the Green River in August 1982. These first 5 victims, found within weeks of each other in the same river, were what gave the case its name and its urgency. But they were only the beginning. Giselle Ann Lovevorn was 17. She disappeared from Seattle in July 1982, and her skeletal remains were found the following year off a rural road south of the city. Deborah Lorraine Estes was 15 years old. She had been in the foster care system, had struggled, and had ended up on Pacific Highway South at an age when most children are worrying about high school. Her remains were found in 1988. Linda Jane Rule was 16. She disappeared in September 1982. Her remains were found in 1983. Denise Darcel Bush was 23, a mother, someone's daughter. She disappeared in October 1982, and her remains were found in Oregon in 1985. Shonda Leah Summers was 16. She disappeared from the strip in October 1982. Her remains were found in 1984. Shirley Marie Sherrill was 18. She disappeared in October 1982. Her remains were not found until 1985. Rebecca Marrero was 20 years old. She disappeared in December 1982. Her remains were not found until 2011, nearly 3 decades after her murder. These are only the 1982 victims from Gary's confirmed list. The names and ages and brief details feel inadequate. They are inadequate because each represents a full human life cut short, a constellation of relationships destroyed, a family permanently diminished. But even these compressed details tell us something important. Nearly all of them were teenagers or young women in their early 20s. Nearly all were in vulnerable circumstances. All were taken from the same strip of highway in SeaTac and the surrounding area, by the same man, in the same methodical way. Into 1983, the killing continued. Sandra K. Gabbert, 17, disappeared in April 1983. Kimmy Pitzer, 16, disappeared in April 1983. Marie Malvar, 18, disappeared in April 1983. Carol Ann Christensen, 21, disappeared in May 1983. Carol Ann Christensen's case would become particularly important to investigators. She was found in May 1983 in a wooded area in Maple Valley, and her staging was unusual. Gary had left a fish lying across her neck, had placed a wine bottle near her, had arranged her body in a way that seemed deliberate and almost theatrical. The staging suggested someone who was comfortable at the dump site, who took his time, who perhaps wanted to leave a mark on the scene. Martina Teresa Authorley, 18, Cheryl Lee Wims, 18, Yvonne Shelley Antosh, 19, Carrie Ann Roys, 15, Sandra Denise Major, 20, Constance Elizabeth Nayon, 21, Kelly Marie Ware, 22, Tammy Charlene Lyles, 15. 15 years old. 14 years old in some cases. These are the ages of children. Pammy Annette Avant, 15. Dolores Laverne Williams, 17. Gail Lynn Matthews, 23. Andrea M. Childers, 19. Sandra K. Counts, 22. The list continued through 1983 and 1984 and 1985. In each of those years, Gary Ridgway was killing multiple women, dumping their bodies in the forests and fields of King County, going to work the next day, attending church, coaching Little League. The sheer number of victims over such an extended period speaks to both Gary's methodical efficiency and to the structural failures that allowed him to continue. He was never far from investigators' awareness. His name remained in the task force files throughout the 1980s, but proximity to the files and proximity to the truth were not the same thing. Mary Bello was 25, Kelly K. McGinnis was 18, Constance Connie Ann Nayan was 21, Tina Marie Thompson, 22, April Dawn Buttram, 17. Every name on this list was a person. Every person had a mother. Many had children of their own. Some had siblings who remembered their laughter, parents who kept their photographs, friends who never forgot them. Cindy Ann Smith was 17. Patricia Ann Michelle Barczak was 19. Roberta Joseph Hayes was 21. Marta Reeves was 36, older than Gary's typical victim, a mother. The killings continued into the late 1980s and 1990s at a reduced but never fully stopped pace. Gary killed less frequently than in the frenzied early years, but he never stopped entirely. As late as 1998, he was still killing. The Green River Task Force had largely concluded that the killings had stopped. They were wrong. Part 5: How he hunted. Understanding how Gary Ridgway operated helps explain both how he killed so many women and how he evaded detection for so long. His methodology was not dramatic or elaborate. It was effective precisely because it was ordinary. Gary's primary hunting ground was Pacific Highway South, the arterial road that runs through SeaTac and connects SeaTac Airport to the city of Federal Way to the south. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, this road was the center of outdoor prostitution in the Seattle metropolitan area. Women worked the sidewalks and parking lots of motels and fast food restaurants, approaching vehicles that slowed, negotiating with drivers who rolled down their windows. Gary was a regular presence on the strip long before he began killing. He had been soliciting prostitutes there since at least the mid-1970s, and he was known to many of the women who worked there as a regular client. This familiarity was crucial to his hunting. He wasn't a stranger pulling up in an unfamiliar vehicle. He was a known face, a man who had hired these women before, a man who paid and didn't cause trouble, or so they believed. His truck was ordinary, a pickup truck of the kind that every third man in the Pacific Northwest drove. His appearance was ordinary, medium height, medium build, brown hair going gray as the years passed. He wore the clothes of a working man. He didn't stand out. He would stop and negotiate a transaction, agree on a price, and drive to a secluded location. His preferred sites were areas he knew well: wooded turnoffs along secondary roads, the back lots of industrial properties, the wooded strips along riverbanks. He knew these places because he drove them regularly, because he had scouted them, because he sometimes used the same locations repeatedly. His method of killing was always the same: manual strangulation, usually from behind or from a position of physical control, using his hands to cut off the blood supply to the brain or to close off the airway. He was strong from years of physical labor and capable of subduing women quickly. The process took minutes. Then he would leave the body, driving away in his truck, returning to whatever his next stop was, going to work or going home or going back to the strip to pick up someone else. Gary later described his killing with a detachment that disturbed even hardened investigators. He spoke about it in the same flat, practical tones he might use to describe a routine maintenance task. He didn't describe rage or excitement or sexual frenzy. He described logistics, sequencing, problem-solving. He was, in his own telling, simply managing a process that he had developed and refined over time. This detachment was not an affectation. Psychological evaluations of Gary Ridgway revealed someone who lacked the capacity for empathy in a fundamental and seemingly constitutional way. He did not experience other people as fully real in the way that psychologically healthy humans do. His victims were not, to him, people in the way that his coworkers or family members were people. They were objects in his world, objects he desired to possess and control, and the ultimate expression of that control was their death. He described having developed what he called a cooling-off mechanism after killing, a period in which he would deliberately not kill because he recognized that killing too frequently increased his risk of detection. This suggests a level of rational calculation that coexisted with his profound pathology. He was not out of control. He was disciplined. He had a system. He also had considerable practical intelligence about forensic evidence. He was careful not to leave biological trace evidence at scenes where it could be linked to him. He was aware of police techniques to the degree that a working-class man with no formal education in forensics could be aware of them, through news coverage of other serial killer cases, through common sense, through the trial-and-error learning that comes from committing crimes and not being caught. He chose his dump sites partly based on accessibility. He needed to be able to reach them quickly with a body in his truck, and partly based on their capacity to degrade evidence. Bodies left in the Pacific Northwest's damp, wooded environments decomposed quickly, particularly in summer. Insects and small animals accelerated the process. By the time many of his victims were found, only skeletal remains were left, remains that could tell investigators relatively little about the exact circumstances of death or the identity of the killer. And yet, for all his calculation and practical precaution, Gary made mistakes. He used condoms sometimes, but not always, leaving biological evidence at some crime scenes. He pawned a watch taken from a victim, a transaction that was later traced. He was seen by witnesses when picking up some victims. His name appeared in the files, but the technology to connect these fragments into a definitive identification did not yet exist. Part 6. The Detective Who Never Gave Up. Detective Dave Reichert had been on the job for barely a year in August 1982 when he waded into the Green River and helped pull out the bodies of Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and later Opal Mills. He was young, idealistic, not yet fully hardened by the realities of homicide investigation. What he saw in that river changed him permanently. Reichert would later describe a promise he made to himself standing on the bank of the Green River in those August days, that he would find the person who did this. Not because it was his job, though it was. Not because his career depended on it, though the case would define his career. But because those women deserved justice, and he was in a position to pursue it. That commitment would be tested repeatedly over the next 20 years. Reichert would be promoted, moved to other assignments, brought back, promoted again, eventually becoming King County Sheriff. Through all of it, the Green River case sat in his office, in his files, in his mind. He consulted with anyone who might help: FBI profilers, other detectives, forensic specialists, and yes, Ted Bundy. He authorized unusual investigative approaches when conventional ones stalled. He also, in those early years, made decisions that he would later agonize over. One of them was allowing Gary Ridgway to walk away after that 1987 interview and polygraph. Reichert was not alone in that decision. It was a task force determination, made by multiple investigators reviewing the available evidence, but it weighed on him. There were other detectives equally committed to the case. Sergeant Frank Adamson led the task force during some of its most intensive years and brought both investigative rigor and considerable compassion for the victims to the work. Robert Keppel, a criminologist who had worked on the Bundy case, provided consulting support that proved valuable over the years. These men, and many others, poured years of their professional lives into a case that often seemed to offer no path forward. The task force used every investigative tool available to them. They analyzed victim patterns to identify the killer's probable operating area. They built detailed databases of everyone who had been seen in proximity to victims before their disappearances. They worked with sketch artists to develop composite images based on witness descriptions. They interviewed thousands of people over the years, following leads that sometimes seemed promising and always dead-ended. They also worked in a complicated relationship with the media. Serial killer cases attract enormous press attention, and the Green River case was no exception. The task force needed public cooperation, tips from people who might have seen something, but too much specific detail in the press could compromise the investigation or alert the killer to their progress. Managing this balance was a constant challenge. In one notable episode, the task force allowed a documentary film crew access to their work, hoping that the resulting exposure would generate new tips. The documentary was completed, aired, and generated considerable attention. It did not identify the killer. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, hundreds of men were investigated as potential Green River killer suspects. Some were investigated extensively, their lives turned upside down, only to be cleared when evidence pointed definitively elsewhere. The scale of the investigative effort was genuinely extraordinary. This was not a case that was neglected or underfunded in the way that Gary had anticipated. It was just a case that the technology of the era could not solve. And then in the 1990s, that technology began to change. Part 7. The DNA Revolution. The development of forensic DNA analysis in the late 1980s and its gradual adoption by law enforcement agencies in the 1990s was not just a scientific achievement. It was a fundamental transformation in the relationship between crime and accountability. For the first time, tiny biological traces left at crime scenes could be matched with near certainty to specific individuals. The Green River Task Force had always maintained physical evidence from the original crime scenes, including biological material recovered from some of the early victims. In the mid-1990s, as DNA technology became more sophisticated and accessible to law enforcement, the task force began revisiting this evidence. The challenge was finding samples that had degraded enough 20-year-old evidence, sometimes from bodies that had been exposed to the elements, but not so degraded that analysis was impossible. Forensic technology was advancing rapidly during this period, and what was impossible to analyze in 1990 might be possible in 1995, and what was ambiguous in 1995 might be definitive in 2000. In 2001, the task force obtained DNA evidence linking Gary Ridgway to several of the Green River murders. The samples, recovered from victims' bodies, were matched against a DNA reference sample that Gary had provided in 1987 during one of his voluntary cooperative interviews with investigators. He had given them the sample himself, apparently confident that it would not implicate him. It did. The match was definitive and overwhelming. The DNA from the crime scenes matched Gary Ridgway's profile with a statistical certainty that left no reasonable possibility of coincidence or error. The man who had sat in interview rooms, passed a polygraph, and walked away free, the man who had killed dozens of women over 2 decades while living a banal suburban life, was identified. On November 30, 2001, a Thursday morning, Gary Ridgway drove to work at Kenworth as he had done for decades. He parked his truck and walked toward the building. He was met by detectives who arrested him in the parking lot where he had worked his entire adult life. Gary was taken into custody calmly. He did not resist, did not run, did not appear surprised. He was 52 years old, his hair thinning, his face unremarkable in the way it had always been unremarkable. He was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder, corresponding to the 4 victims for whom DNA evidence had been obtained. Dave Reichert, now the King County Sheriff, was not at the arrest scene but was informed immediately. Nearly 20 years after wading into the Green River and seeing those bodies, he had the news he'd been waiting for. The arrest of Gary Ridgway was front-page news across the country and around the world. The Green River Killer, who had haunted the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades, had been identified. He was not a dramatic monster. He was a truck painter from Auburn. Part 8: The Plea Deal and the Hunt for the Dead. The arrest of Gary Ridgway on 4 murder counts was only the beginning of what would prove to be an extraordinarily complex legal and investigative process. King County prosecutor Norm Malung faced a decision that had profound implications for justice, for the victims' families, and for the possibility of recovering the bodies of women who were still missing. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence on the 4 DNA-linked murders. Conviction was essentially certain, but Gary Ridgway had killed not 4 women, he had killed dozens, and many of those women had never been found. Their families had spent years, in some cases decades, not knowing whether their daughters or sisters or mothers were alive or dead, not knowing where they were, unable to grieve fully or properly because there was no body, no grave, no confirmation of death. Prosecutor Malung and the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office engaged in an extended negotiation with Gary's defense attorneys. The fundamental question was, could Gary Ridgway be induced to provide full confessions and assistance in locating the remains of all his victims? And if so, what would the state be willing to offer in exchange? The answer, after extensive deliberation and consultation with victims' families, was yes, and the price was Gary's life. In November 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, to provide complete and truthful information about all his murders, to help locate the remains of missing victims, and to submit to extensive debriefing by investigators. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty. Gary Ridgway would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea deal was controversial. Many people, including some of the victims' families, were furious that Gary Ridgway would not be executed. They felt that a man who had murdered 48 women and likely many more deserved to die for those crimes. They felt that allowing him to live, even in prison, was a profound injustice. Others, including some families and many of the investigators who had worked the case for decades, supported the deal. They understood that Gary's cooperation could provide something irreplaceable: the locations of missing victims, answers to families who had lived with uncertainty for years, the closure that comes with knowing where a loved one's remains rest. Some victims might never be found without Gary's help. The information he could provide was worth more to those families than his execution. Norm Malung made the decision in full awareness of its moral complexity. He acknowledged that Gary Ridgway deserved to die. He also acknowledged that finding the bodies of missing women was a legitimate and important goal, and that Gary's cooperation was the only means of achieving it. He chose closure over retribution, and he made that choice explicitly and publicly, taking responsibility for it. The plea was entered on November 5, 2003, in a King County courtroom packed with victims' families, investigators, media, and members of the public. Gary Ridgway stood before the court and read through the 48 charges against him, each one a name, a date, a brief description of a killing. As he read, victims' families sat in the gallery and listened to the name of their loved one spoken aloud, the murder acknowledged formally for the first time. Some families wept. Some sat in rigid silence. Some had written statements they would deliver to the court, and they delivered them with devastating power. Words about the daughters and sisters and mothers they had lost, about the years of uncertainty, about the damage that uncertainty had done to their families and their lives, about what justice meant and whether this qualified. One family member who addressed the court was Robert Rule, whose daughter Linda had been one of Gary's victims. Rule spoke quietly but with immense dignity, saying that he forgave Gary Ridgway not for Gary's sake, but for his own, because carrying hatred for decades had damaged him as much as the crime itself. It was a moment of extraordinary moral courage that silenced the courtroom. Others were less forgiving. They spoke of rage and loss, of children who would never come home, of grandchildren their daughters never got to know. They spoke of Gary Ridgway's worthlessness, his evil, the inadequacy of any punishment to address what he had done. They were right. There is no punishment proportionate to 48 or 70+ murders. There is only what the system can offer and what can be done with it. Gary stood and listened to all of this. He wept, apparently, or appeared to weep. Whether the tears were genuine or performative was debated by observers. Gary himself was not fully trusted by anyone in that courtroom, even by the investigators who had worked with him for years by that point. After the guilty pleas were entered, sentencing was deferred, while investigators worked with Gary to gather information. Part 9. The Confessions and the Search. The debriefing of Gary Ridgway was one of the most unusual undertakings in the history of American law enforcement. For months after his arrest and guilty plea, investigators sat with Gary in a specially arranged facility, spending hundreds of hours listening to his detailed accounts of murder after murder after murder. The investigators who conducted these debriefings, primarily Detective Tom Jensen and a small team of others, described the experience as deeply disturbing and at times almost surreal. Gary spoke about his killings in the same flat, practical tones he'd always spoken in. He discussed murder logistics the way a contractor might discuss project management. He had specific memories of some killings and vague or confused memories of others, and separating the accurate recollections from the confused or self-serving ones required enormous investigative effort. Gary was motivated to cooperate fully. His life depended on it. If investigators determined that he was withholding information or providing false leads, the plea deal could potentially unravel. He understood this, and so he tried to be genuinely useful. He provided detailed descriptions of dump sites, including locations where no remains had been found. He led investigators on drives through King County, pointing out specific roads and turnoffs where he had left bodies. Some of these sites yielded remains. Women who had been missing for decades, whose families had never known where they were found in wooded areas of King County based on Gary's directions. The recoveries were conducted with great care and with the involvement of victim identification specialists. Each set of remains was processed, analyzed, and identified where possible, and the families were notified. The emotions of families receiving these notifications varied enormously. Some expressed relief, a horrible word in this context, but relief nonetheless. The relief of finally knowing, of being able to hold a funeral, of being able to visit a grave. Others expressed renewed grief, as the notification reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Some expressed anger, both at Gary and at the years of not knowing. Gary also provided information about killings that investigators had not previously attributed to him. He described women he had killed in Oregon and possibly other states. He provided details about victims who had never been reported missing, women whose disappearances had gone unnoticed or undocumented because of their isolated circumstances. These revelations expanded the scope of the case beyond anything the task force had initially imagined. The question of Gary's total victim count became a subject of considerable discussion. Gary himself claimed numbers that fluctuated between 70 and 90 over the course of his debriefings, though he acknowledged that his memories were not reliable enough to provide definitive numbers for every killing. Investigators believe the confirmed count of 49 significantly undercounts the actual total, but proving additional murders without remains or corroborating evidence is not legally possible. One particularly significant aspect of the debriefings was Gary's description of the emotional experience, or rather, the lack of it associated with killing. He described the act of murder as something he engaged in the way other people might engage in a hobby. It satisfied something in him, a need for control and possession, but it didn't feel extraordinary to him. It didn't feel wrong. He had separated himself from any moral framework that might have placed his actions in the context of crime or sin. This near-total absence of empathy, of moral feeling, is one of the most disturbing aspects of Gary Ridgway's psychology and one of the most difficult to comprehend for people whose own moral architecture is intact. How does a person kill 48 confirmed victims, more than 70 by his own account, without experiencing guilt, without being haunted by dreams, without breaking down in some fashion? The answer seems to be that Gary's empathic capacity was so profoundly limited that his victims simply didn't register as morally significant. They were objects. He was using them and disposing of them. The fact that they had inner lives, fears, loved ones, futures, these facts didn't penetrate his consciousness in any meaningful way. This is not the same as saying he was mentally ill in the traditional sense. Gary was found legally competent for trial, was capable of understanding the charges against him, was capable of making decisions about his plea and his cooperation. His pathology was not psychosis. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it was illegal. His pathology was the near-complete absence of whatever quality of consciousness allows most people to care about other people's suffering. Part 10, the VICTIMS Part 2. The victims of Gary Ridgway numbered 49 by the time of his plea, and included women ranging in age from their mid-teens to their 30s. Each name deserves to be spoken fully. Each life deserves to be remembered. And the unavoidable truth is that no documentary of any length can do full justice to 49 individual lives. But we owe it to them to try. Yvonne Antosh was 19 years old. She had grown up in the area and had a daughter she adored. She disappeared in 1983, and her remains were found in 1984. Constance Nayan was 21. She was working to support herself and had ambitions for a better life. Her remains were found in 1983. Kelly Ware was 22, a young woman who had struggled with difficult circumstances and was trying to find her way. Her remains were found in 1983. Tammy Lyles was 15 years old. She vanished in the same terrible cluster of 1983 disappearances, and her remains were found in 1985. Pammy Avent was 15. Her life was cut off so early that the cruelty of it is almost impossible to comprehend. Dolores Williams was 17. Andrea Childers was 19. Kelly McGinnis was 18, a young woman with a vibrant personality whom friends remembered vividly. Mary Bello was 25, old enough to have known another life before the streets took her. Dub Bonner was 23. April Buttram was 17. Cindy Smith was 17 when she disappeared. Patricia Barczak was 19. Roberta Hayes was 21. Marta Reeves was 36, older than most of Gary's victims, a mother, a woman with a longer history and more people who missed her. Amina Agishev was 36. She was older than Gary's typical targets, a working woman who had disappeared under circumstances that left her case initially uncertain. She was eventually identified among his victims. Tracy Winston was 19. Maureen Feeney was 19. Mary Exetta West was 16. Cindy Ann Smith, 17. Carrie Royce, 15. Sandra Counts, 22. 15, 16, 17, 18. These ages recur like a terrible refrain throughout the list of victims. Girls who should have been in school, applying for jobs, planning their futures, arguing with their parents, falling in love. Instead, they were on Pacific Highway South, trying to survive, and Gary Ridgway stopped and offered them a transaction and instead gave them death. Cheryl Wims, 19. Martina Authorley, 18. Yvonne Antosh, 19. Gail Matthews, 23. Andrea Childers, 19. Sandra Gabbert, 17. Kimikai Pitzer, 16. Marie Malvar, 18. Marie Malvar's story is particularly haunting because her family actually saw Gary's truck. Marie had told her boyfriend before she got into Gary's pickup that she would call him. She never did. Her boyfriend and her father had seen the truck, had noted the color and approximate make. They had gone to police and reported their concerns. Police had gone to Gary's house and spoken to him. Gary had denied any knowledge of Marie Malvar, and without a body or more evidence, police had left. Marie Malvar's remains were not found until 2003, after Gary's arrest, when he led investigators to her dump site. Her family had spent 20 years not knowing where she was. The names continue: Sandy Nayon, Michelle Denise Gooseby, Colleen Renee Brockman, Debbie Mae Abernathy, Tracy Ann Winston, Maureen Sue Feeney. Each one a person, each one missed. In 1990, Gary killed Roberta Gordek, 22 years old. In 1993, he killed Marta Reeves. In 1998, he killed Patricia Yellowrobe, 36, his last confirmed victim. Patricia Yellowrobe was killed in 1998. By that time, the Green River Task Force had largely concluded that the Green River killings had stopped, that whoever the killer was, he had either died or stopped or moved away. They were wrong. Gary was still killing, still working his truck painting job, still attending church, still living in his house in Auburn. Patricia Yellowrobe was 36 years old. She had a family. She deserved to live. Part 11. The SENTNCING. On December 18, 2003, Gary Leon Ridgway appeared in King County Superior Court for sentencing. He had pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, the largest number of murder charges in American criminal history at that time. The 49th murder charge was added later, bringing the final count to 49. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families sat in reserved seats, many of them having traveled considerable distances to be present. Investigators who had worked the case for years were there: Dave Reichert, Tom Jensen, and many others. Media occupied designated areas. The public gallery was full. Judge Richard Jones presided. He was a measured, thoughtful jurist who understood the weight of what he was about to do. There was no question about the outcome. The plea agreement determined the sentence. But the proceeding was nonetheless momentous, a formal accounting of crimes so numerous and so devastating that the legal system had barely a framework for addressing them. Before sentencing, Gary addressed the court. His statement was lengthy and, to many observers, unsatisfying, an account of his crimes that mixed acknowledgement with what seemed like continued attempts at justification or mitigation. He spoke about his victims without visible emotion. He said he was sorry, though whether this apology was sincere or performative was impossible to determine. Victims' families then spoke. This portion of the proceeding lasted hours and was one of the most emotionally intense legal proceedings in the history of King County. Mothers who had spent 20 years not knowing what had happened to their daughters stood in court and said their names. Fathers described the decades of grief. Siblings described growing up in the shadow of absence. Several family members addressed Gary directly, looking at him across the courtroom. Some expressed fury. Some expressed grief. Some expressed forgiveness, in the tradition of Robert Rule, who had spoken at the plea hearing. The range of human responses to devastating loss was on full display. Gary sat and listened. He cried at some points, or appeared to. Whether his emotion was genuine was a question that observers could not answer definitively, and that investigators who knew him well were skeptical about. Judge Jones sentenced Gary Ridgway to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, 48 concurrent life sentences, plus additional terms for the associated charges. The judge noted that he personally believed the death penalty was the appropriate outcome for Gary's crimes, but that he was bound by the terms of the plea agreement and the legitimate reasoning behind it. He honored the agreement without enthusiasm. Gary Ridgway was transported to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he has remained ever since. He is housed in a maximum security unit, separated from the general prison population. He has continued to cooperate with investigators periodically on additional missing person cases. He will die in prison. He will never be released. He will spend whatever remains of his life in a cell, in an institution, removed from the world in which he operated for so long. Whether this is justice is a question each person must answer for themselves. Part 12. The investigators and their aftermath. The Green River case shaped the careers and lives of every investigator who worked it in profound ways. For some, the long dedication to an unsolved case was a source of professional frustration that took years to process after Gary's arrest. For others, the resolution brought a measure of peace, though never complete peace, because peace is difficult when you have spent years studying the aftermath of such suffering. Dave Reichert went on to serve as King County Sheriff until 2004, when he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, where he served multiple terms. He wrote Chasing the Devil, My 20-Year Quest to Capture the Green River Killer, in 2004, a book that combined personal memoir with investigative history. Reichert was candid about both the successes and the failures of the investigation, about the moments when Gary had been within reach and had slipped away, about the knowledge that faster identification might have saved lives. This last point bears dwelling on. Gary Ridgway was first questioned in 1982. He was questioned again and again in the years that followed. He gave a DNA sample in 1987. That DNA sample sat in evidence files for 14 years before matching technology was applied to it definitively. In those 14 years, Gary killed dozens more women. How many of those women might have lived if the technology had been available earlier? How many victims might have been saved if the DNA match had been made in 1990 instead of 2001? These questions have no certain answers, but they haunt everyone who worked the case. Detective Tom Jensen, who led the debriefing sessions with Gary after his arrest, described the experience of those sessions as the most professionally and personally challenging of his career. Spending hundreds of hours with Gary Ridgway, extracting information about murders, navigating the complicated dynamics of a plea deal relationship with a serial killer, was a unique and consuming experience. Jensen was instrumental in locating the remains of several victims through Gary's information, and the value of that work to the families of those women was immeasurable. But the personal cost of the work was real. The Green River Task Force ultimately achieved what it had set out to achieve: the identification, arrest, and conviction of the Green River Killer. But the path to that achievement took 2 decades, consumed enormous resources, and was marked by failures as well as successes. The case influenced law enforcement practices nationally. The use of DNA databases in cold cases, which has since become standard practice, was accelerated in part by the Green River investigation and by several other high-profile cold case DNA identifications from the same era. Investigative best practices for serial killer cases, victim-centered approaches, better interdepartmental communication, systematic evidence preservation, were refined in the wake of the Green River investigation and others like it. The case also became a model for studying predatory serial killers of the organized type, killers who are not impulsive or visibly disturbed, who maintain functional lives while killing, who evade detection through ordinary behavior rather than through dramatic countermeasures. Understanding how Gary operated has improved investigative approaches to similar cases nationally and internationally. Part 13. The Cultural Impact and Psychological Analysis. Gary Ridgway's case occupies a distinctive place in the criminological literature and in American true crime culture. He is distinguished from many other serial killers in this series not by the nature of his crimes, though their scale is extreme, but by their duration, their number, and the nearly complete ordinariness of the man who committed them. The psychological analysis of Gary Ridgway begins with the concept of the organized serial killer, a type first systematically described by FBI profilers in the late 1970s and early 1980s, based partly on interview research with convicted serial killers. The organized killer in this taxonomy is methodical and controlled, plans his crimes in advance, takes precautions to avoid detection, selects victims deliberately, and is typically capable of maintaining a functional social life alongside his criminal activity. Gary Ridgway is perhaps the most extreme example of this type ever documented. He killed for approximately 18 years without detection. He maintained a marriage, a job, a church community, and a social identity throughout that period. He showed no outward signs of mental disturbance, no dramatic behavioral changes, no slipping of his mask. The organized-disorganized typology has been refined and critiqued since its introduction, and modern criminologists tend to view it as a spectrum rather than a binary. But Gary's case represents something genuinely useful about the organized end of that spectrum. The recognition that the most prolific killers may be the least dramatic, the most apparently normal, the most effective at inhabiting the social world of ordinary life. What drove Gary Ridgway to kill? The psychological evaluation conducted in connection with his legal proceedings identified several relevant factors. First, the early sexual confusion created by his mother's inappropriate behavior toward him. Augusta Jane had instilled in E. Jane a pathological attachment to his mother that warped his psychology completely. Mary Ridgway's confusing sexualization of Gary created different but also damaging distortions in his developing psyche, a fusion of sexuality and maternal authority that expressed itself in deeply disturbing ways. Second, Gary developed powerful sexual control fantasies beginning in early adolescence that centered on women in positions of vulnerability. These fantasies became the organizing principle of his inner life, the constant that he returned to, the lens through which he processed experience. Third, Gary's nearly total lack of empathy meant that these fantasies were never checked by any genuine concern for the welfare of the women he fantasized about. Normal people who have dark thoughts, and research suggests that transient dark thoughts are not unusual, are checked by empathy, by moral feeling, by the capacity to imagine the suffering of others. Gary had none of this capacity in any meaningful form. His inner fantasies ran unchecked to their logical conclusion. Fourth, his early experiences of violence, the stabbing incident at 13, the absence of consequences, may have reinforced the connection between violence and gratification, and established that violent impulses could be acted on without consequence. Gary himself, when asked about his motivation in the debriefing sessions, was not able to provide a psychologically sophisticated account. He spoke in practical terms. He wanted to control women, he liked having power over them, killing them gave him that power permanently. He spoke about the women on the strip as if they were a resource to be exploited. He showed no remorse, and when he expressed what appeared to be regret, investigators were skeptical that it was genuine. One of the most disturbing aspects of Gary's case from a psychological perspective is the implications of what he was able to do without being caught. If Gary Ridgway could kill 49 women over 18 years while working a regular job and attending church, What does that tell us about our ability to identify dangerous people in our communities? What does it tell us about the limitations of social perception, of community awareness, of the professional judgments made by police officers who interviewed him multiple times? The uncomfortable answer is that ordinary social interactions are not reliable indicators of the presence of profound psychopathy. Gary's social performance, his politeness, his reliability at work, his church-going, his apparent normality, was not a mask in the dramatic sense. It was simply the behavior required to navigate a social world from which he was genuinely dissociated. He wasn't pretending to be normal while secretly tortured by his crimes. He was simply operating in two separate registers, with no more discomfort than most people feel when they shift from a work mode to a home mode. This is what makes the most dangerous serial killers so difficult to identify before they kill. They are not remarkable. They are not tortured geniuses or dramatic monsters. They are, most often, unremarkable people who happen to lack whatever quality of mind prevents most human beings from acting on violent impulses. The dramatic serial killer of popular culture is a fiction. Gary Ridgway was the reality. Part 14. Gary Ridgway in prison. Gary Ridgway has been housed at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla since his sentencing in 2003. He is now in his mid-70s, a small, gray-haired man who spends his days in the routine of maximum security prison life. He has continued to cooperate with investigators on some outstanding cases, providing additional information about murders and dump sites as the years have passed. Some of this cooperation has led to the identification of additional remains. Some has led investigators to areas where remains may exist but have not yet been found. The work of finding all of Gary's victims is, as of this writing, still ongoing. Gary has given interviews over the years to researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers, though with decreasing frequency as time has passed. His interviews are notable for their continued flat affect, their practical rather than emotional register, their apparent lack of insight into the impact of what he has done. He divorced Judith after his arrest. Judith, who described herself as devastated by the revelation of who Gary really was, worked to rebuild her life and has maintained a public silence about the case since the initial proceedings. She deserves the privacy she has sought. Gary has reportedly become a born-again Christian in prison, or at least has adopted the outward practice of Christianity, attending prison chapel services, participating in Bible study. Whether this represents any genuine spiritual transformation, or whether it is simply the continuation of the church-going behavior that provided him cover for decades, is something only Gary knows, if he knows it himself. He will die in prison. He is not eligible for parole. He will never again drive Pacific Highway South or sit in his truck in the parking lots of motels in SeaTac or live in the quiet house in Auburn. He will never again hurt anyone. This is a genuine achievement of the criminal justice system. Gary Ridgway has been removed from the world permanently. Whatever else can be said about the system's failures in this case, the decades of missed opportunities, the women who died while he remained free, the final accounting is that he was found, he was convicted, and he will spend the rest of his life in a cage. Part 15. The ongoing search for victims. One of the most difficult aspects of the Green River case is the knowledge that not all of Gary's victims have been found. Gary himself claimed to have killed more than 70 women, and while investigators are appropriately skeptical of his self-reported numbers, the confirmed count of 49 is likely a significant undercount of the actual total. Some women who disappeared from the SeaTac corridor in the 1980s and 1990s are still listed as missing persons. Some may have died of other causes or moved away and lost contact with family. But some, almost certainly, are victims of Gary Ridgway whose remains have not yet been located. Gary has provided some information about additional dump sites during his years of cooperation, and investigators have searched these sites with varying results. Some searches have found skeletal remains. Others have found nothing, either because Gary's memory was faulty, because the remains have been dispersed by the elements, or because the remains were never there. The Pacific Northwest's climate is particularly challenging for long-term remains recovery. The combination of rainfall, acidic soils, dense vegetation, and wildlife means that bodies left in wooded areas may be largely gone within years, their skeletal remains scattered and fragmented beyond easy discovery. For the families of missing women who disappeared during the years Gary was active, the question of whether their loved one was among his victims remains a source of anguish. Some have sought definitive answers through legal proceedings or through engagement with the investigation. Some have come to terms with permanent uncertainty. Some have never made peace with not knowing. The King County Medical Examiner's Office and the Green River Task Force's successor organizations continue to work on cold cases that may be connected to Gary Ridgway, and periodically new identifications are made. The development of additional forensic techniques, including advances in skeletal analysis and environmental DNA, may eventually provide answers that current methods cannot. The search continues. It will likely continue for years. Part 16. Justice, Memory, and Meaning. The Green River case raises profound questions about justice. What it means, whether it's possible, whether the justice system can ever adequately address crimes of this scale. Gary Ridgway received 49 life sentences. He will die in prison. By the conventional metrics of the criminal justice system, justice was served. The perpetrator was identified, prosecuted, and punished. He will never hurt anyone again. But justice in this narrow legal sense is insufficient to address the actual weight of what happened. 49 women are dead. More are probably dead. Families were destroyed. Communities were traumatized. Years of life were stolen from people who deserved to live them. No legal outcome changes any of this. No sentence, however severe, restores what was taken. Execution would not restore it. Life imprisonment does not restore it. The scale of the harm is simply beyond the capacity of any justice system to address proportionately. What the justice system can offer, and what it did offer in the Green River case, is accountability, the formal, public acknowledgement of what was done and who did it. This is not nothing. For families who spent years not knowing if their loved ones were dead, not knowing who had killed them, the formal acknowledgement that Gary Ridgway killed their daughter or sister or mother, and that this was wrong and that he will be punished, this matters. It does not heal, but it acknowledges. The plea deal also offered something else: information. Bodies were found, remains were identified, families received the closure of knowing where their loved ones were, of being able to hold services, of having a grave to visit. This is an unusual outcome in serial killer cases, which often end with outstanding victims and unresolved questions. The Green River case, because of the deliberate choice to prioritize information over execution, achieved more victim identification than it otherwise would have. Whether this trade-off was right is something each person, particularly each victim's family member, must assess for themselves. There is no universally correct answer. What is clear is that the victims deserve to be remembered as people, not as numbers or as entries in a list of crimes. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They had names and faces and voices and laughter. They had futures that were taken from them by a man who saw them as objects rather than people. This fundamental disrespect, Gary's treating of human beings as things to be used and discarded, is the deepest offense of his crimes, deeper even than the murders themselves. To remember them as people is the most important form of justice we can offer. To say their names, to acknowledge their lives, to refuse to let them be reduced to a number in a body count or a line item in a criminal case. The Green River has continued to flow through King County, through Auburn and Tukwila and the communities that line its banks. It is a beautiful river still, green with reflected trees in summer, quick with snowmelt in spring. Salmon still run through it. People fish from its banks. Children play near its edges. The river that gave this case its name has been restored in the public imagination to something other than a burial ground. But for those who know its history, who remember what was found there in August 1982, it will always carry those memories. The river keeps moving. The dead do not. Part 17. Final Aria Felicitiones. Gary Leon Ridgway killed more confirmed victims than any other serial killer in American history. He killed for 18 years. He lived as an ordinary man throughout. He was caught not by brilliant detection or lucky circumstance, but by the slow advance of technology that finally made his biological traces undeniable. The case tells us several important things that deserve to be stated clearly. It tells us that evil does not look like evil. Gary Ridgway looked like a truck painter from SeaTac because that is what he was. The serial killer of our imagination, brilliant, dramatic, charismatic, visibly disturbed, is a fiction that can actively mislead our threat assessment. The most dangerous killers may be the most ordinary. It tells us that vulnerable people are more vulnerable than we like to admit. Gary chose his victims with calculation. He chose women who he believed would not be missed, would not be searched for, whose disappearances would generate less investigative urgency. This calculation was not entirely wrong, and the fact that it was not entirely wrong indicts not Gary alone, but the social conditions that made some women's lives and deaths less visible than others. It tells us that technology changes everything. Without DNA analysis, Gary Ridgway might never have been identified. His case would be an unsolved cold file, the Green River Killer an unidentified ghost. The development and deployment of forensic DNA technology is one of the most significant advances in criminal justice of the past half-century, and the Green River case is one of its most important demonstrations. It tells us that persistence matters. Dave Reichert and the investigators who kept working this case for 2 decades, who maintained the files when funding was cut and attention shifted, who never formally closed the case, they mattered. Their persistence kept the possibility of resolution alive long enough for the technology to catch up. And it tells us again to remember the victims. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16. Deborah Estes was 15. Tammy Lyles was 15. Pammy Avant was 15. These were children. These were people. Their names deserve to be spoken, their lives deserve to be honored, and their deaths deserve to mean something, not as a monument to Gary Ridgway's depravity, but as a reminder of what is owed to the most vulnerable among us. Conclusion. On November 30, 2001, Gary Leon Ridgway walked toward the entrance of the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, Washington, as he had done every working day for most of his adult life. He was met by detectives who arrested him in the parking lot. 20 years of killing, 20 years of investigation, 20 years of families not knowing, all of it converging at 8 in the morning in a parking lot in Renton. Gary was 52 years old. He had married 3 times. He had a son. He had colleagues who liked him. He had neighbors who thought he was quiet and decent. He had attended church and quoted scripture. And he had murdered at least 49 women whose names were Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hines, Opal Charmin Mills, Giselle Ann Lovevorn, Deborah Lorraine Estes, Linda Jane Rule, Denise Darcel Bush, Shonda Leah Summers, Shirley Marie Sherrill, Rebecca Marrero, Sandra K. Gabbert, Kimmy Kai Pitzer, Marie Malvar, Carol Ann Christensen, Martina Teresa Authorley, Cheryl Lee Wims, Yvonne Shelley Antosh, Carrie Ann Royce, Sandra Denise Major, Constance Elizabeth Nayon, Kelly Marie Ware, Tammy Charlene Lyles, Pammy Annette Avant, Dolores Laverne Williams, Gail Lynn Matthews, Andrea M. Childers, Sandra K. Counts, Mary Bello, Kelly K. McGinnis, Connie Nayon, Tina Marie Thompson, April Dawn Buttram, Cindy Ann Smith, Patricia Ann Barksek, Roberta Joseph Hayes, Marta Reeves, Amina Ajashef, Tracy Winston, Maureen Feeney, Mary Exetta West, Cynthia Hines, Dub Bonner, Colleen Brockman, Debbie Abernathy, Patricia Yellowrobe, and the others, unnamed in official records, whose remains wait still in the forests of King County. These were people. They were someone's daughters. Many were mothers.